Good morning. I'm Michal Divon, filling in for Yael Levi. It is Thursday, July 14th, 2016, and this is your morning edition here on i24 News. Coming up today, holding but fragile is what many are calling the Iran deal 1 year later. On its one-year anniversary, we look at the agreement between 6 world powers and Tehran. Was it a historic opportunity or historic disaster, as many warned? Theresa May is sworn in as Britain's Prime Minister and presents her new cabinet with some familiar faces. And later on the show, we speak to the EU ambassador to Israel and take the pulse of the relationship. But first, i24 News anchor Tal Heinrich with this morning's headlines. Take it away.
Thank you, Paul. Good morning. The Amaq news agency linked to so-called Islamic State has confirmed the death of key leader Omar Shishani. It said Shishani was killed in combat in the town of Shirkat, south of Mosul, in Iraq. The Pentagon announced in March he has died from injuries sustained in a U.S. airstrike in northeastern Syria. The red-bearded jihadist was said to be a close military advisor to Islamic State leader Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. And here in Israel, a demonstration in solidarity with the Israeli soldier Elor Azariah on trial for killing a subdued Palestinian assailant was attacked by members of a radical leftist group on Wednesday in Tel Aviv. According to the police, 5 masked suspects charged at the demonstrators, with one spraying them with tear gas. According to photographs uploaded by the leftist Antifa group on Facebook, former lawmaker Michael Ben-Ari, who participated in the demonstration, was hurt by tear gas. The suspects were arrested by the police. The United Nations Secretary General's envoy to South Sudan urged the country's warring factions to respect the ceasefire, now in its 3rd day. This stopped heavy fighting that the UN said was likely to have killed more than a government estimate of 272 people. Ellen Margaret Loy, head of the UN mission in South Sudan, spoke after she met with the country's president, Salva Kiir.
As I have done publicly during the last couple of days, I urge everybody to lay down the gun and respect the ceasefire that His Excellency the President has directed, and the First Vice President has approved to. We really need to find a political solution in South Sudan and move forward in peace for the benefit of the people of South Sudan.
Former London Mayor Boris Johnson was appointed British Foreign Minister by the country's new Prime Minister, Theresa May. Johnson was a leading figure in the victorious Leave campaign in Britain's European Union membership referendum last month. His role in Britain's negotiations over its future relationship with the EU is likely to be limited because May has created a new ministerial post focused on Brexit. May has appointed David Davis, former junior foreign minister and strong Brexit advocate, to lead the country's negotiations with the EU. And the U.S. State Department looks forward to working with Boris Johnson as British Foreign Secretary. A U.S. State Department spokesman said the United States will always be able to work with British officials because of its deep, abiding relationship with Britain.
We congratulate Foreign Secretary Hammond on his new role, and we look forward to engaging with Boris Johnson as the new Foreign Secretary. This is something, frankly, that goes beyond a relationship, that goes beyond personalities, and it is a absolutely critical moment in certainly England's history, but also in the U.S.-UK relationship.
And those were the top stories for this hour. We'll be back with more live updates in just 20 minutes. For more news stories, you can also check our website. That's i24news.tv. Michal, back to you now.
Thank you, Tal. We'll be expanding on these stories as we move along. 1 year ago, on July 14th, 2015, 6 world powers and Iran finalized almost 2 years of negotiations on the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. The pact outlined what Tehran had to do to pull back its nuclear program from the brink of weapons-making capacity. And it spelled out the West's obligations to end many financial, trade, and oil sanctions that had battered Iran's economy. But there's been some disappointment in Iran, particularly as the lifting of the sanctions have yet to yield significant investments. Despite the lifting of nuclear-related penalties, Washington and the European Union maintained some sanctions on Iran over its human rights record and ballistic missile testing. And many international investors and banks are still weary of doing business with the Islamic Republic. Has the deal been successful so far? We'll talk about the different angles very soon, but first, let's take a look at the following report by i24 News correspondent Danny Swibel.
On July 14, 2015, world powers struck a monumental deal with Iran. Under the agreement, sanctions on Iran would be lifted in exchange for the reduction of its stockpile of nuclear fuel, as well as the dismantling of thousands of machines. Tehran would be forced to destroy the reactor core in its heavy water reactor and virtually eliminate any path to the bomb. International monitors would ensure Iran would abide by the agreement. Iranian President Hassan Rouhani on Wednesday said the country would remain, quote, faithful to its promises 1 year after the deal was signed.
The sanctions related to the nuclear issue were lifted. Of course, in some fields, including banking, we still haven't reached the expected level. If one day the P5+1 decides to give up its commitment, we will still remain faithful to our promises.
The deal has worked out better than expected. As Tehran has moved far away from constructing a nuclear weapon, Iran's economy is in recovery with the lifting of sanctions as well as the release of billions of dollars in frozen assets. The Americans hoped this would lead to cooler and calmer relations with the Iranians, but their hardliners and the Revolutionary Guards have continued to expand their anti-American agenda and grow more confrontational and stronger by the day. Iran continues to play a heavy role in conflicts in Iraq, Syria, and Yemen. Iranian missile tests conducted in March were, quote, not consistent with the spirit of the nuclear agreement. This according to UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon. U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry and Iran's Foreign Minister Mohammad Javad Zarif continue to consult with each other regularly. But many experts are concerned that this relationship is all that keeps the two sides talking. And when they both leave office, the link between the two countries will virtually disappear. 1 year on, more questions remain regarding Iran's relationship with the U.S. and the West than answers.
And joining me now in studio is i24 News Foreign Affairs editor Owen Alterman and Dr. Emily Landau, the director of the Arms Control and Regional Security Program at the INSS. Thank you both for joining me this morning.
Sure.
Good morning.
So it's been, good morning, 1 year since Iran and 6 world powers have reached the nuclear deal. The 159-page memorandum was released. I know, Owen, you've read it all. The deal has not produced the economic boom expected for.
That's the question, and it's a bit of an open question, Michal. On the one hand, up through March of 2016, economic growth in Iran was quite slow, 0.9%, and there was a lot of disappointment. At this point, the IMF projecting for 2016, I assume for calendar year 2016, 4 to 5% economic growth, much stronger. However, that said, there's still a sense that a lot of foreign companies staying on the sidelines, not going into Iran, and there are some interesting theories about why that's true.
Absolutely. Now, Dr. Landau, maybe we can talk about some of the technicalities of the agreement. Has Iran lived up to the expectations
of the international community as far as the deal? Look, I think any assessment of Iran's compliance with the JCPOA has to be conducted in context, and the context here is critical. And there's two important points in this regard. First of all, Iran made very minimal nuclear concessions. We need to keep that in mind. The concessions that Iran made did not undermine its breakout capability, which was what was uppermost in the Iranian negotiators' minds, keeping that breakout capability. Second of all, Iran knew that the formula was concessions for sanctions relief. So they went into the negotiations with the formula, they want minimal nuclear concessions in order to get maximum sanctions relief. And they realized that the international community was not going to give them that sanction relief unless there were some nuclear concessions. But they were, from the start, minimal. In addition, Iran has not upheld everything, to the letter. First of all, it has produced heavy water in excess of the limits of the nuclear deal. And curiously enough, the Obama administration has agreed to purchase 32 tons of the heavy water that Iran has produced in excess. In other words, not only has Iran not upheld the deal, but the United States is buying the excess heavy water.
Looking at the United States, and maybe Owen, you can answer this next question. You wrote an article about Article 36, saying basically the deal itself includes an article saying that it can be null and void based on this clause within 36 days, if I'm not mistaken, 35 days. So speaking about the U.S. stance, the next administration, whomever it may be, could easily exit the deal without even having to lobby for it heavily.
Well, first of all, I want to say that at the time I wrote that piece, I was actually working with Emily at the Institute for National Security Studies. Right. It's great to be here on studio together. I don't know about celebrating the one-year anniversary, but at least marking it. Look, Michal, you're absolutely right. This deal was viewed as something that was binding on the United States for 10 years, for 15 years, and in some parts of the deal for eternity. The reality is a little bit different. There's an escape hatch. There's an escape clause. There's an exit ramp from this deal. Now, it's true the United States will have to point to an Iranian violation, but as long as it can credibly do that, a new president, January 21st, 2017, can take that route, can leave the deal, and can do it under cover of law, doesn't need Congress, doesn't need to renegotiate, and it is a very, very important point. Now, that doesn't mean that the president is going to want to do it. A lot of deal opponents in the United States, a lot of prominent deal opponents in the United States, don't think it would be a good idea to ditch the deal. They want to take other steps to try to enforce. We can look at what, for example, Congress is doing, or House Republicans are trying to do on the Boeing deal.
What about the House trying to, with the Boeing deal, trying to block it? How will this come into play? And the next administration, if it isn't within their interest, how quick could this indeed happen?
Well, it's a very interesting point, because a lot of the moves in the House are expected to be vetoed by President Obama. Not clear if there will be enough of a two-thirds majority to override those vetoes. But sure, if there's a Republican president in the White House, or even a Democratic president, Hillary Clinton, who would take a different position, depending on circumstances, you could imagine something like that happening, and it could be very dramatic. That said, again, I would say that especially if Hillary Clinton is in office, I doubt that would happen. But if Donald Trump, you never know. And that is true. It is something that could change, and we could see this change in the margins, even if the deal isn't ditched in its entirety.
Indeed. Now, Dr. Lando, you mentioned the clock still ticking because they made the limited concessions and wanted the maximum uplifting of sanctions. Is this the right way to look at it?
Well, I think the way to look at the deal is, yes, Iran has kept its breakout capability. The success, if we can call it that, of this deal will hinge critically on whether the P5+1 hold Iran to its commitments. In other words, everything hinges on the political will of the P5+1, specifically of the United States. And unfortunately, what we've seen over the past year is the exact opposite. We see the United States projecting that the last thing they want to happen is for something to undermine this deal. And this has translated into tremendous leverage for the Iranians. All they need to do is hint that they might leave the deal. I mean, Owen addressed whether the U.S. could
leave, and its implementation hasn't been done.
This clause, the same clause, can be used by Iran.
Exactly. Although it would take a little bit longer to fully implement, but either side could exit the deal at any point that they would choose.
But Iran keeps threatening that they will do it. We just heard Rouhani on the anniversary of the deal saying, Iran can leave, Iran can go back to what it was doing.
And hardliners continue to expand the anti-America Accord. We're going to be joined now via Skype by Dr. Tamara Gindin, an expert in the study of Iran, a lecturer at the Shalem College of Liberal Arts, and a researcher at the Esri Center for Iran and Persian Gulf Studies, who regularly monitors Farsi media and chat rooms. Good morning to you.
Good morning.
So it's been 1 year since the agreement came into effect, and the Iranian people are expressing some disappointment following the deal signing. There was a lot of optimism at the time of its signing. Where are they today as far as their feeling?
Right. The optimism at the time of the signing, people flowing to the streets and dancing and singing it, was because they didn't read the agreement and they expected things to change overnight. They expected the whole economy to improve overnight. They didn't read. Now there was recently a poll that said more people know that even when the deal is fully implemented, things will not be. The sanctions are not completely lifted.
But the economy, and this our own economy editor said that the economy has increased 45%. So maybe it's not at the pace that they would like, but the incoming funds have shown the economy now make a huge leap as compared to the prior year before the signing of the deal.
Of course, and I feel from what I see in social media that the disappointment is more in the press and more in sites and news sites related to the government, which means that it comes from above, from the more conservative part of the political map,
who weren't necessarily for the deal in the first place. Now, where would the Iranians like to see themselves, from what you're seeing in social media, moving forward, from a social, from a human rights standpoint, from a financial standpoint? What are the expectations?
From a human rights standpoint, it was expected. Many of my Iranian friends predicted, and this is what happened, that the human rights situation will worsen because the government wants to show that the fact that we've been weak because all these negotiations and giving up some of your stances means weakness. They say we have been weak before the West. It doesn't mean we will be weak when it comes to human rights. So human rights situation has worsened. Hijab situation, the cover for women, is now enforced more strongly, including undercover agents for hijab inspection.
And are people expressing, are citizens and people on the street expressing this worsening of their day-to-day life, of stricter religious reforms?
No, because it's not that present in day-to-day life unless you're a political activist, in which case you're in greater danger. Or if your hijab, the hijab has to be tighter in most places. It doesn't completely work, and it isn't seen, at least from a visual standpoint, as any change. Tamar, I want to thank you at this point for weighing in. And Owen, Tamar did mention the human rights abuses that have actually become worse, and I know that you mentioned that some of the sanctions in this relation have actually never been lifted.
Right.
So where does this stand?
Well, sure. The nuclear deal only lifted nuclear sanctions, non-nuclear sanctions, at least American non-nuclear sanctions. Certainly American non-nuclear sanctions against U.S. persons and U.S. companies stayed on the books and haven't moved. That was never part of the U.S. obligation under the deal. Now, what we're hearing from the Iranian government, and our guest just alluded to this, is they're saying, well, hold on. The spirit of the deal was reconciliation. We're not getting the full economic fruits. We need to see more relief. Maybe it wasn't in the four corners of the deal document, but we need to see you do more. And Emily referred to some of those steps. We need to see you trying to encourage people to come in and encourage companies to come in and encourage banks to come in and invest in Iran, but not part of the deal itself.
And yet a lot of European investors, a lot of American investors are actually scared of the certain sanctions that could be on individual persons, and this is keeping them back from fully expanding this financial potential with Iran.
That is one theory.
Well,
yeah.
I mean, it's important to keep in mind that there's no obligation, according to the deal, to do the things that the Iranians are complaining are not happening. And on the other side, I think taking into account some of the things that Tamar just said about, the increased strictness with regard to some of the, the hijab and other things in Iran, what we're not seeing in Iran is any moderation since the deal was implemented, since the deal was announced last year. And remember, this was a major part of the Obama administration agenda, was this deal deal is an indication of moderation, and it will lead to further moderation.
And the election results would also indicate the certain flow to a more conservative standpoint.
Well, certainly in terms of the Speaker of the Majlis, of the Parliament, and the head of the Assembly of Experts. So things are not moving in the direction that was hinted at, and more than hinted at, almost promised. And also in terms, of course, of Iran's foreign policy. If we look at Syria, if we look at its ballistic missile tests, we're seeing an emboldened Iran rather than a more moderate Iran. And I think this also needs to be part of any assessment of the deal.
And some actions of goodwill wouldn't hurt, perhaps, in this regard. And not only the technicalities, Dr. Emily Landau, Owen Alterman, I'd like to thank you at this point for being with me and weighing in on the Iran deal this morning as we move along. Theresa May, Britain's new Prime Minister, sworn in last evening, will lead the country out of the EU. When and how? Well, these are all questions that are being raised with the expectation that the Prime Minister will soon provide the answers. May arrived at 10 Downing Street yesterday, replacing former Prime Minister David Cameron, and revealed the much-anticipated new cabinet, with the biggest shock being the appointment of Boris Johnson as Foreign Secretary. Let's take a look at all the latest details in the following report by i24 News correspondent Ezra Taylor.
On her first day in power as Prime Minister, Theresa May arrived in Downing Street with her husband Philip, fresh from her appointment with the Queen. Ready and waiting was the world's media, microphones poised, ready to hear how she'll run the country.
The government I lead will be driven not by the interests of the privileged few, but by yours. We will do everything we can to give you more control over your lives.
As the day progressed, it was all change in Downing Street as Prime Minister May decided on her new cabinet, who's in and who's out. By her side in number 11 Downing Street, no longer Foreign Secretary, Philip Hammond, now Chancellor of the Exchequer, seen as a steady hand to manage Britain's turbulent finances. The new Foreign Secretary, by far the biggest surprise. Boris Johnson, a strong campaigner for leaving the EU, he'll now be involved in that very process. And other top jobs, Home Secretary Amber Rudd, Defence Secretary Michael Fallon, and the new jobs, Secretary of State for exiting the EU, David Davis, and Secretary of State for International Trade, Liam Fox, both now responsible for the deals Britain strikes as the country leaves the EU. Meanwhile, on the other side of British politics, the Labour Party prepares to fight it out. Angela Eagle and Owen Smith, both vying Corbyn for the top job, though many now expect the party to split.
And we're now joined via Skype from London by i24 News UK correspondent Jonathan Satradati. Good morning to you.
Good morning.
So as May revealed her cabinet, the biggest shock unquestionably is the appointment of Boris Johnson as Foreign Secretary. Why do you suppose she made this decision?
The choice of Boris is a big surprise to many people, and an interesting one, because it shows Theresa May to be quite a cunning and wily operator. She's brought Boris back, essentially, from oblivion. Remember that he was one of the leading figures in the Brexit campaign, and he was also the former London mayor, very high-profile politician. The thing about Boris, though, is that he's much loved by voters. He adds a bit of magic to the Conservative Party, a bit of a human edge, and even though he's very gaffe-prone, often putting his foot in his mouth and saying exactly the wrong thing, especially on the international stage, he is somebody that is popular with voters nonetheless. So she is really hedging her bets, bringing him in as Foreign Secretary and saying that this man who stood for Brexit will now have one of the most important roles in her cabinet. But then we look below the surface and we see that she's taken away the Brexit part of the job by having a specific person in charge of that, David Davis. And she is also, perhaps, setting Mr. Johnson up for another fall. And bear in mind that should he mess up again on her watch, she will kick him out as quickly as she can. And once again, these two politicians who have really vied with each other in the past may do so again.
And Jonathan, surprisingly enough, she didn't appoint more female members to her cabinet as many thought she would be doing.
Early days to say. She still has to announce the rest of her cabinet, and there's plenty of room for women in there. So the briefing that she might do that could still come true.
Now, May stepped into a new position with a very passionate address to the people. What are the key issues on her agenda based on her address last evening?
Well, she's positioned herself far more in the centre, moving the party left from where David Cameron had it, saying she'll work for ordinary working people and narrowing that poverty gap. But we've yet to see if she'll even have time in the remainder of the government to do very much else other than the Brexit negotiations and to change that sort of strategy.
And quickly, if you can just mention the recent leadership of Corbyn, which is now taking on a certain twist.
Indeed, we have Owen Smith and Angela Eagle, both of them trying to get the Labour leadership position. But the fact that there are two of them running for it and Corbyn against them means that that vote could be split and he could well be put back in place as the leader of the Labour Party.
Which is what many are now predicting. And quickly, looking at Theresa May and Israel, she's been a consistent supporter of the Jewish community in the UK. What might her stance be against Israel? Can we see the same tone being reflected to the Jewish state?
The Conservative Party over recent years and under David Cameron has been pretty solid on Israel, has occasional criticisms, but also it's been a fairly firm friend. Theresa May could carry that on, but we've little indication yet, other than one speech she once gave to a Jewish audience, of what it is that she will personally do should Israel be engaged in another war, for example.
Jonathan Satradati, thank you very much for joining us this morning. Now, after the break, following the passage of the controversial bill requiring Israeli NGOs to disclose their foreign funding, we'll talk to the EU ambassador here to hear his reactions. But first, your headlines.